Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Salesforce Ben LinkedIn Live. So my name is Zaina Dar, and I'm the events content producer at Salesforce Ben. And I'm really excited to be your host for today's event as we take a deep dive into the world of Salesforce Flow and explore how it can be used to transform your integration processes without the need for coding. So this event will provide you with really valuable insights and practical tips to empower you to harness the full potential of Salesforce Flow. So get ready to learn how to streamline your workflows, automate repetitive tasks, and seamlessly connect Salesforce with external systems without writing a single line of code. You'll also want to stick around for a tutorial on how to build your first integration with Flow. So while we wait for everyone to join, let us know where you're logging in from today. We always love to see what a global audience we have attending. Okay, let's get started. So thank you so much to everyone for joining us today. I'm really excited to introduce you to Tom Bassett, Solutions Architect at Vera Solutions. Tom, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Tom Bassett. I am Solutions Architect, as you said, based in London in the UK. Really looking forward to diving into how to build integrations with Flow today. I'm involved in a number of different things in the Salesforce community, including being an answers leader, an expert author for Salesforce Ben. I help Salesforce test and refactor exams and super badges and speak at various events as well. So super looking forward to this session and diving into the world of Flow.
Nice, thank you. So before we get started, just a bit of housekeeping. So as this is a webinar, all lines are muted, but don't worry. We'll be having a Q&A at the end for you to ask Tom any burning questions you may have. So feel free to submit the questions in the comments throughout the webinar. The webinar will also be recorded and will be available on our Salesforce Ben LinkedIn and YouTube channel, just in case you need to drop off or would like to share it with your colleagues. Great, well, I'll hand it over to you, Tom, to take us through the presentation, and I'll see you at the end for the Q&A.
Awesome, thanks. Okay, thanks everybody again for joining today, and I hope you're looking forward to diving in about how we can build integrations with Salesforce Flow without needing to write a single line of code. So first up, a little bit about me. I've given you a little bit of an introduction already, but my name is Tom Bassett. On social media, including YouTube, you can find me at TomForce92. And I'm a Flow evangelist amongst lots of other things Salesforce related. I help to run a local user group in my area and am really passionate about Flow in particular as well, and super excited to dive into explain to you how you can start to build integrations, so connect different systems with Salesforce using Flow, and ultimately be able to achieve that without writing any code. So before we kind of dive into the steps on how to achieve this, I wanted to run you through some of the background and give you some much needed context, really. So today's agenda, we've broken up into different things. The first section is about giving you that background, that context. So we're going to dive in some technical definitions. We're then going to pivot to a how-to section and ultimately go through the steps that you would go through if you are building an integration with Flow. We'll then switch to a live demo where I've got a Flow ready to show you, which dynamically calls out for exchange rates and then returns those exchange rates into Salesforce. And we'll then wrap up the session with some useful video resources and some other written resources before flipping over into a Q&A section. So first up, definitions. The first definition to kind of clarify or to go through really in today's session is HTTP request. This sounds quite complicated and quite technical, but if we break it down into simple terms, it's a way for systems to send messages or communicate with each other. These requests are formed of different methods. So we have a get, post, delete, and patch methods. they ultimately perform slightly different functions dependent on the method that we're going to use. But think about it as kind of sending a letter in the mail. You're posting a message and then that's being received by somebody else. That, in kind of simple terms, is really what a HTTP request is. Next up, under definitions, Salesforce flow. So hopefully this isn't too new to anybody on the call. Salesforce are kind of bigging up flow with every release. We get a few more new features and new tools to play with in flow. However, if you are kind of new to flow, then in, again, high level, this is a clicks, not code automation tool that provides an interface for Salesforce admins to automatically update, create, and delete records, as well as perform actions and potentially, like we're going to show you today, interact with external systems as well. And the screenshot here is giving you a kind of tease of that, whereby this flow is actually sending something out to Slack as a particular action, and it's adding somebody to a Slack channel. So next up, under definitions, this is where we kind of bring HTTP call out and flow together. So within flow, you can create a HTTP call out to perform kind of a get, post, patch request. And this is ultimately a clicks, not code way of sending a request to an external system and receiving a response from that external system. So there's quite a wide range of different possibilities here as to how you could use this. And I've got some example use cases for you in a couple of slides time to kind of get you thinking about how this might apply to your organization or the Salesforce orgs that you look after. So we're now pivoting into the how-to, and a great way to get started in this section is to dive into some of those use cases that I've been teasing already. So from here, we could use this functionality to integrate with another system or an API that provides exchange rates to us. We can then use those exchange rates to update records in Salesforce or store them for future reference. We could also verify a customer's ID using an external system. We could maybe create a request in Salesforce and then send that request to the external system to verify a customer's ID, particularly important if you're working in financial services or banking. Another way to use this is to potentially validate or check address information. So you could call out to a service that perhaps validates a zip code if you're in the States or a postal code if you're in the UK, and ultimately tells you if that's a valid reference, and could perhaps also return other details such as the geolocation tag or coordinates as well. Another way is really kind of off the wall example here, but you can use it to retrieve weather information as well. Maybe you're looking at a lead and you know that that lead is based in Spain. You could get the weather for Spain and then perhaps incorporate that into your messaging with that potential prospect or client. Another use case could be to get the delivery status. Maybe you're a company that sends physical products to people and you've got a client on the phone and they want to know where their FedEx delivery is. You could perhaps call out to that external delivery provider and retrieve that status. So you're able to then resolve that client's query kind of on the phone. You can also use this to create support tickets too. And by support tickets, I'm not talking about Salesforce cases. I'm talking about perhaps having something happen in Salesforce which creates a ticket in Jira, or maybe you're using Zendesk or another support ticket provider, and ultimately you want something in Salesforce to trigger for something to happen in the external system. That's the type of use case that you can accommodate using HTTP requests in Flow. And also you can use it to validate phone numbers as well. So perhaps you work with lots of different countries and you want to verify that this phone number is in the correct format using the area code and dashes and kind of special characters and things like that. You could take that phone number from Salesforce, send it to the external system, and then the external system or external API could then validate that phone number and then send you a response to let you know if that's actually a valid phone number or not. So those are some common use cases on how you can use this functionality. Next up, we're actually going to run you through some high-level steps on what you need to go through to set this up in your org. If you haven't explored this already, some of these terms might be fresh or new to you. And ultimately, this diagram here, which I've borrowed from Salesforce admins, provides a great way to split up these steps into 4 easy to follow parts. So the first part about setting a integration with Salesforce Flow is ultimately setting up your system so that you can authenticate with the external system. So say we're authenticating with another system that's going to return exchange rates to us. In order to do that from Salesforce setup, we would need to create an external credential. You would need to assign that a principal. You would then give users access to that via a permission set and package the whole thing together using a named credential. The second step is actually within the flow, creating the HTTP callout action. And this is where once you've set up your authentication in the first step, you then dive into the flow builder, which you might be familiar with already, and ultimately provide the structure for the type of request you're going to send. So you would tell the flow builder whether it's a get or a post request, for example, and you may also provide an example request and response dependent on the type of request. And this is kind of where the magic of Flow really comes in, because you've got a nice, easy to use interface here that guides you through the process in kind of a setup wizard style way. And behind the scenes, this actually generates some Apex for you. It also generates an external service and some other items under the hood as such. So the system does the heavy lifting for you. It's ultimately kind of writing that code for you, really. So you don't ever have to kind of dive into that code. The system has generated it for you and given you a way of calling that code and those methods in the future when you want to reach them with Flow. The third step to this is ultimately about configuring the action. So this is about that Apex class that would have been defined for you in the previous step. This is where you actually push values into that Apex class. So maybe you've got an account that you want to send to the external system. As a result, you would need to assign that account name to that Apex class, so you can ultimately map those things together. You might also push other attributes like the billing address so that you can receive that in the external system and then do the necessary processing. And those two actions kind of quite similar, where the fourth step is ultimately assigning the fields, as I've said already, for the Apex defined class and understanding what information ultimately from Salesforce you're going to be pushing to the external system via that Apex that the system is created for you automatically under the hood, and then ultimately going ahead to create that flow action and thoroughly test it to make sure that it works as expected. Another tool that flow builders can utilize here is the ability to transform data between different data sources or different systems. So the idea behind this functionality, it's currently within beta, is that you can ultimately get data from an external data source and then map that data into perhaps a Salesforce object. So maybe you've got your exchange rates from your external system and you want to map that into an object in Salesforce. That's really high level what this functionality is designed to do. Over the last 2 releases, Salesforce have enhanced this functionality and made it a little bit better. So super excited to see where this goes in the future. And hopefully in a few releases time, it will lose its beta sticker and go into something that's generally available and therefore supported by Salesforce. So appreciate I may have kind of lost some of you guys with the technical requirements, but for people in the audience, for the developers in the audience, perhaps thinking about this from a technical point of view, it's worth noting that the HTTP callout inflow does have a number of restrictions or limitations that are perhaps more technical in data. So the first point here really is certain data types behave in certain ways. That's a way to kind of make the first bullet point a little bit less technical there. The second one is if you need to include headers, include those headers within the named credential. As with most things in Salesforce, there are limits. So when you use a HTTP callout inflow, this counts towards your overall API request limit. And also there's a limit to the number of external services that you can have within Salesforce, which is what Salesforce actually generates for you under the hood. So bear in mind that both of these things will count towards those 2 separate limits. If you are retrieving data and there's lots of levels, bear in mind you can have up to 15 levels of fields and objects in a JSON hierarchy. And from a compatibility point of view, this is looking for something that is within the Open API 2.0 or Open API 3.0 JSON schemas. And something to bear in mind is this may seem quite technical, and it is quite technical, but ultimately as an admin, developer, architect, consultant, it's useful to be aware that there are these restrictions in place, these limitations to safeguard the system. And ultimately, if you were building one of these callouts and you needed support, then you could perhaps escalate to somebody more technical if you are starting to kind of face some of these challenges. So I appreciate I've done a lot of talking already in this session, but the good news is I'm now about to switch over into the demo part. And this is where I'm going to show you a flow that I built earlier. And our use case is ultimately calling out an external system to fetch the latest exchange rates. So this flow is a screen flow, and it's formed of different steps. The first step is displaying to me what exchange rates are currently within the Salesforce org. So today's the 14th of March, and the exchange rates I've currently got for Euro is 1.17 and USD 1.28. When I press fetch rates, that is then going to call out to an external system and ultimately check if those rates are still current or valid. So my flow has now made the external call out, and it's returned to me the latest exchange rates. In this case, the exchange rates haven't actually updated, and you can see that I've customized the messaging here. So when I press commit rates, those rates are now stored in Salesforce. And what I like to do, just for kind of testing and sanity purposes really, is display the Salesforce ID here, so I can double check that the records have been committed to the system, or they've been updated as expected. If I were to then roll this out to end users, I'd probably remove that ID column, but that, from my point of view, is a great way to troubleshoot and to ultimately just double check as you're building this that it's working as expected and the right record in Salesforce has been created, updated, or deleted, whatever you're doing. And you've got a Salesforce ID to check that against. So that brings me quite nicely to the kind of end of the demo section. So let's flip back to the slides and run you through some resources. Let's see if we can get the slides back up on screen. Okay, so seems like we're having a few issues with the slide, so that's fine. We're live. These things happen. Oh, here we go. So bringing this session to a close, or at least the deck part of it, I've got some resources for you to check out to ultimately kind of get hands-on with this functionality and start to build integrations with clicks, not code. The first two are some videos on my own YouTube channel, which is at TomForce92. I've got a video on how to use the transform element in Flow that I spoke about a little bit earlier. And I've also got kind of a complete end-to-end demo on how to use a HTTP callout in Flow to fetch bank holiday information, commit those bank holidays in Salesforce as holiday records, which then stops my Service Cloud SLAs from being counted while there is a company or a bank holiday. So that's the example there. We've got the QR codes on screen and we can circulate the links afterwards as well. In addition to that, just in case videos aren't your preferred method of learning, we've got some other resources here. So the first one is a great online tool that I use to explore and find APIs that I can integrate with. Obviously, if you're a Salesforce partner working for a client, that's probably somewhat limited. You probably already know what API you're going to use and the high-level use case. But the Open API catalog here, which is the first link, is a great kind of online catalog or library of APIs that I sometimes dive into to kind of roll up my sleeves and start playing with. The other resource here is a module on Trailhead, which is ultimately talking about how to make a HTTP call out without code, and again, kind of running you through those steps with some kind of hands-on challenges. Apologies, actually, that last link is a article by Yumi, and it kind of dives into the written theory of what I've spoken about today and guides you through an example. The next link, this is definitely the Trailhead one this time. So it's a quick start project on Trailhead on how to create these HTTP callouts with Flow Builder. And additionally, within the Trailblazer community, there is a community group that you can use if you are having kind of any technical problems or you can use that to browse and get an idea of what other people are using this functionality for as well. So that brings me to the end of the deck, and we'll now pivot over into the Q&A section.
Well, thank you so much for that really engaging presentation, Tom. Hopefully our audience now feels much better equipped to tackle their integration challenges with confidence and efficiency. So without further ado, it's now time for our Q&A. So if you have any questions for Tom, please feel free to submit them in the comments and we'll try to get around to as many as possible. Okay, so to begin with, how have you used HTTP flow callout in the real world?
Yeah, okay, that's a great question. So one of the use cases within the slides is actually a real use case that I've used with one of my clients before, and that was to verify a customer's ID. We ultimately created a record in Salesforce to act as their kind of identity verification, and then built an action in Flow to send that information to the external system. And then the external system was then in charge of sending that customer or the client a text message. And they then went through that text message and verified their ID, scanned their passport or their driving license, and then ultimately to retrieve that information back into Salesforce. For that use case, we decided to actually write some code to do that bit. But ultimately, on a scheduled basis, Salesforce then checked the status of those requests and then returned the status back to Salesforce. So, for example, whether that was an ID pass, an ID fail, or if there was suspicious activity or kind of fraud, that would then come back into Salesforce, and ultimately the sales rep would then be able to take the appropriate action. So that's one of my real use cases there.
Right, fab. If anyone's joining, please feel free to leave your questions in the comments, and we'll try to get around to as many as possible. So we've got a question here. How would you implement HTTP callout functionality in Flow with regard to preventing the 100% per transaction limit for callouts?
Okay, cool. So that is a great question. Usually when I'm thinking about this, I'm ultimately thinking about it in a way that limits the number of requests I'm going to make to the external system. Perhaps I'm just doing it on a record by record basis, but I certainly wouldn't be making multiple callouts within the same flow. I would potentially be packaging all of my callouts together and then pushing those to the external system, and then ultimately retrieving the responses one kind of block, and then ultimately looping around that block to perform the necessary logic in Salesforce, for example, updating my exchange rates.
Okay, cool. So are there any considerations for record triggered flows?
Yeah, so something to consider with record triggered flows is if you are going to be using an external action or calling out to an external system, it's best to pop that on a separate path. Within Flow Builder, you might have seen already the ability to run automation kind of asynchronously. So in the example that I showed you a kind of glimpse of earlier in the Flow Builder, when my flow was calling out to Slack, it was doing that asynchronously, which in non-technical terms means the request goes into a queue and Salesforce decides when to process it. So it doesn't quite happen real time, but that way you can avoid hitting any errors or limits in the system.
Okay. When would you use the transform element versus assignment on the flow canvas?
Yeah, okay. So this is an interesting one. The transform element itself is still currently in beta. So what that means from a Salesforce point of view is right now, if you are using it, it's not part of your kind of contract with Salesforce. And unfortunately, what that means at the current time, you can't reach out to Salesforce support if it breaks or something goes wrong or it doesn't work as expected. So I would personally right now use that element kind of with caution and with those considerations in mind. The older way of doing it is using an assignment element instead. There are ultimately pros and cons to using each, but that's why I'm really kind of excited to see what the future holds for the transform element. Because it's still in beta, it means Salesforce are kind of still tinkering with it behind the scenes and making changes to it. And in the last release, they actually gave us the ability to, I believe, kind of sum and aggregate things using the transform element, which before you kind of had to do a manual workaround to achieve the same thing. So right now, I would probably lean towards using the assignment. And in the near future, looking forward to kind of making the full transition to the transform.
Okay, nice. When would you use the transform element versus assignment on the Flow canvas? Oh, we've just done that, haven't we?
Yeah.
What's the best way to test during development of a HTTP flow callout?
Yeah. So I like this question because I can explain how I would do it. Ultimately, as I'm building an action, I would be testing this iteratively while I am building it. So each part of the action, I would be testing to make sure that it's working as expected. Am I able to authenticate with the external system successfully? Is it retrieving the correct records? Am I getting back the expected response? Because ultimately, when you start using one of these actions, you might find that the external system needs data in a particular way. Maybe it doesn't support any decimal places. Maybe it needs particular values as strings instead of pick list values, for example. And there are some other kind of considerations there. So I would definitely kind of lean towards building these types of integrations in parts and testing as you're going along, kind of putting those parts together and ultimately seeing how far you can get that way and making sure that if you are making changes, that ultimately the changes you're making don't break an earlier part of something that was once working successfully as well. So kind of an iterative approach, really.
Okay, no, cool. Just for the people who have just joined us, please feel free to leave your comments and questions in the comments below, and we'll try to get around to as many as possible. So is there ever the case to switch to Apex instead of a HTTP flow callout?
Yeah, so this is probably a little bit of a hot topic right now in the community, at least. With each release, Flow gets a little bit more of the power that was once only limited to something you can do in Apex. So something to consider here is how many records am I potentially going to be processing? How long is that going to take Flow to process? And also, I guess, the mechanism to retrieve those records as well. So for example, if you need to call out to an external system and you're expecting thousands of records back, or you ultimately perhaps need to do some complex logic or transformation to the information that you receive back, you might be kind of be more beneficial doing that in something like Apex Overflow. Flow is a great way for those kind of simpler integrations, as I said, going back to the example earlier of the customer's ID, you can ultimately get the information from Salesforce, push that into the external system, and receive maybe the verification URL back. So that's a kind of a simple use case. I think as Flow develops and we get new functionalities in Flow, it'll be able to handle more of those complex use cases. But for now, that's kind of where I would draw the line between the two different sets of functionality.
Okay, fab. How does Salesforce Flow compare to traditional coding methods for building integrations?
Yeah, so I guess the beauty or the power of it being in Salesforce Flow is that ultimately you're doing this without looking at the code yourself. The system is generating the code for you. So from a skill set point of view, this moves something kind of towards the traditional admin skill set arena versus needing a developer to actually write custom code for you to build an integration. Maybe an admin or somebody that's perhaps on the path to becoming a developer could achieve that using Flow without having to write the code, because ultimately the system is generating the code and the external service for you in the background. So yeah, that's kind of how it compares. And I guess over time, we'll perhaps get used to building more integrations in Flow and less integrations in Apex. We'll see how that develops over time.
Okay, nice. Can you provide some real-world examples of successful integrations built using Salesforce Flow's HTTP requests?
Yeah, so a couple of examples, and I'm probably going to cheat a little bit here because using exchange rates is the demo that I use that. I know of a couple of clients that have needed to do something very similar, and they've done it using HTTP callout. Another example to ultimately kind of validate an address or retrieve the zip code. It was something along those lines. That was another real life example that I kind of had hands-on experience with. And then we've got my kind of demo example on my YouTube channel on how to retrieve bank holidays for any country and ultimately store those bank holidays in Salesforce. And then my other kind of real life example of using it to verify somebody's ID. Yeah.
Okay, nice. So how would you implement HTTP callouts and flows while taking other triggered flows with DML in the same transaction into account?
Yeah, so I think this type of question and the key to this is understanding what type of flow you're going to use to do the external call out, the order of that flow, but also the execution order of your before save and after save flows as well. I think it kind of comes down to thorough testing and make sure that what you're building or building on top of doesn't call another flow, which then creates an error or breaks something else down the line. So I think it's kind of about thorough testing and making sure that as you're testing things, you're testing them with realistic test data and also realistic data volumes as well.
Yeah, okay. So what are some common pitfalls to avoid when working with Salesforce Flow for integrations?
Not necessarily a common pitfall, but I think a common challenge, at least from my point of view, is actually the initial authentication. Ultimately connecting to different types of systems They require different types of authentication. Some of them might use an API key. Another one might require no authentication at all. It's a publicly available system. So I guess kind of turning it back into the question, really, a common pitfall that I have, at least from my own point of view, is that initial verification and getting that to work. Once that's worked, I can then usually kind of overcome the other challenges quite quickly. There's always a kind of a knack to being able to reach that external system and then being able to successfully authenticate with it. At least in my experience, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Everyone joining, please feel free to leave your questions in the comments. How does Salesforce Flow handle security considerations when integrating with external systems?
Yeah, so that's an interesting one. And actually within the slides, I touched on that slightly. The suggestion here is to store your authentication keys securely in the external credential object, link that external credential object to a name credential, and then use that to securely call an external system. So maybe an external system has an API key. You would, for example, store that as an external credential, which is kind of a locked down part of the system. And the interesting part to it is to have access to that external credential, you have to create what's called a principal. And even the system admin can't access it unless they have specific access to that principal. They could still face an error. So that's kind of how Salesforce locks it down and tries to keep things as secure and compliant as possible.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. So can you walk us through a typical workflow of creating and testing an integration with Salesforce Flow?
Yeah, sure. So the typical workflow kind of really comes back to those 4 steps that Salesforce provided on their admin blog. The first step being to create the authentication record. So a little bit back to what I was just saying about the external credential, the named credential, giving people access to those authentication parameters ultimately. That would be the first step. And within that step, you would also set the header of the request to include any API keys dependent on what the external system needed. You would then kind of switch into the flow builder itself and create the HTTP callout action. And behind the scenes or under the hood, that would generate the external service and some Apex on your behalf, which will then facilitate that external action. The next part of that is creating a Apex variable. And that Apex variable is a little bit like other variables within Flow, but that's ultimately used to define what's sent to the external system. And then the fourth part is about assigning values to that variable. So within the variable, you might have parameters for, as I said earlier, like account details. So you might assign an account name, a billing postcode, description, and industry to that variable. And then that information or those parameters would then be sent out to the external system, and ultimately kind of make up your request. Once you've done that and you've kind of got your request and it's been sent out and you've got a response within the flow, kind of an additional 5th step really is to process that information. So in my example, I took the exchange rates and then committed those to Salesforce in the dated exchange rates object, which is an object kind of behind the scenes. you could potentially use it to match up to records. You might kind of use that matching to then update records with the latest information. And you could perform kind of other logic there as well. So those are the main steps. As I say, the kind of initial 4 steps borrowed from that Salesforce guide. And then the 5th step is really kind of about looping over that data and doing something with it in Salesforce.
Okay, nice. To address this question, so Tom did a tutorial of kind of how to build your first integration with Flow earlier on. So if you either rewind or check out this stream on our Salesforce Ben YouTube channel, you should be able to watch the full stream if you missed the first part. Okay, so currently using the out-of-box Zoom app to bring in webinar registrations, can manually approve registrants, but would like this to approve them automatically with Flow. Is this possible with this?
Yeah, so I have some experience with the Zoom APIs actually, and from experience, they perform in a certain way. So I guess the kind of question in response to this is, would the API on the Zoom side allow for you to send basically an approval back to it? And also there would be other considerations there in terms of how many individual participants do you have on your Zoom webinar? Are you going to be sending approvals for each participant, or are you going to be sending approvals for a batch of participants at one time? Because as kind of I mentioned earlier, this functionality does use your API limit within Salesforce, or consume part of it. So that's part of the consideration here. I appreciate you probably have lots of API calls, and in reality wouldn't go near that limit, but there is something to think about. And I guess the other part of it is, does the Zoom API support like sending requests one at a time, or sending requests in bulk? And then also, what's your business process like? If you want to automatically approve participants based on certain condition, can you do that in an automated way using Flow, or does there still need to be some kind of human interaction? Maybe a human manually screens it and then presses approve or reject. Like, what is the kind of end-to-end process would probably be my follow-up questions. Somebody like Zoom probably does have an open API connection that you could use and ultimately experiment with. But I think there are some kind of other business process type questions there to think about first. And appreciate it's a little bit difficult when you're talking technical like this, but ultimately kind of goes back a little bit to what your user story is, what your acceptance criteria is, in a solution agnostic way. So maybe that's that you want to automatically approve participants if they are in the US region, for example. And then you need to kind of tie your solution to that requirement. So yeah, that's my advice there.
Thank you. Sound advice. Are there any limitations or constraints to be aware of when using HTTP requests in Salesforce Flow?
Yeah, so as we are using functionality within Salesforce, there are kind of limits within Salesforce on purpose to protect the integrity of the system and to make sure that you don't perhaps lock out your org and another customer's org at the same time, because it's all on shared infrastructure. So the standard Salesforce limits that you have within Flow do still apply. It uses API calls, so something to perhaps at least be aware of. You're probably not realistically going to need to monitor it, but something to be aware of. And it does also, as I said earlier, count towards the maximum number of external services you can have in the org as well. So there are some limits. In summary, I think a great way to make sure that you're within those limits is to thoroughly test with realistic data and also realistic data volumes as well, just to make sure that you stay within those limits.
Great. So for which use cases is Flow HTTP callout not suited, and would you advise to revert to an Apex action?
Yeah, so this is a great question. And ultimately within Flow, you can do the majority of the operations that you can do within Apex. There might be a particular operation or conversion or transformation, whatever it is, that would perhaps be a little bit more efficient to do in a couple of lines of Apex rather than kind of numerous elements on the Flow canvas. So that might be a use case. Another kind of example would be perhaps thinking about data volumes. Like, am I going to need to resort to something like the bulk API to perform my requests because I'm talking about like hundreds of thousands of records? That would kind of push you towards Apex instead. And also, I guess, in terms of connectivity, like, does the endpoint actually support Open API 2.0 or 3.0? Because if it doesn't, then you're going to have to resort to Apex anyway. So I think those are some key considerations. There are obviously a few more, but I think those are the highlights there.
Fab. Have there been any recent changes or updates to Salesforce APIs that could impact our integrations?
Okay, so that's a good question. So technically, with every Salesforce release, the current API version increases by 1. I think we're on version 59 or 60 at the moment, and the next release will bring us to the version higher than that. Sometimes Salesforce does make changes to their APIs, and that ultimately can impact or break things. My advice is to kind of, before every Salesforce release, sandboxes are usually upgraded before, thoroughly testing in a sandbox to make sure that things don't break with the latest release, and also reviewing those release updates, which were way back when, I think called critical updates. Because if there is a change in how Salesforce behaves in a particular API, then it's more likely to come in the form of a release update. For example, Salesforce have been pushing out release updates that change how Apex callouts and their headers behave, for example. And there are other release updates that they've been pushing out as well, which apply to specific parts of code or an integration. So that would be my advice, to kind of stay on top of those release updates and to test any updates in the sandbox before your production org is migrated. Yeah.
Okay, nice. So we've just got a couple more questions. How do you recommend approaching complex integration scenarios with multiple external systems involved?
Yeah, so that probably doesn't make a great candidate for something that you would integrate with Flow. If you've got multiple external systems, you would probably want a middleware or something like MuleSoft in between to kind of facilitate all of those different connections, and the error handling and everything is then kind of done in one centralized place. The way I kind of see a call out in Flow is for kind of one direct integration between Salesforce and another system. If we're talking about multiple systems, it probably needs something a little bit more kind of advanced to facilitate that and to perhaps manage the communication between the different systems along the path. Yeah.
Right. And what are some advanced features or functionalities within Salesforce Flow that users may not be aware of, but could greatly enhance their integration capabilities?
Yeah, so there are definitely more advanced features in Flow that are perhaps less talked about than others. Some examples include the transform element, which we spoke about a little bit earlier, and you can use that to transform data from basically a source to a target. So that's definitely something that's a little bit more advanced. You can also use other elements when you have retrieved information from an external source to perhaps sort those records in a certain way, to filter out certain records as well. Those are the kind of more advanced yellow, orange elements on the flow canvas. And then you have the other elements on the canvas that are kind of more traditional and definitely more spoken about, like the loop element and the assignment element that have been around for a while and are perhaps more well known. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, we are coming up to the hour, so unfortunately, that's all we've got time for today. So thank you so much to everyone for attending. We hope you've gained valuable insights into how to leverage Salesforce Flow for effortless integrations, and feeling inspired to implement these strategies in your own projects. So feel free to connect with Tom on LinkedIn if you have any further questions, and check out Tom's YouTube channel, TomForce92, to learn more about all things Salesforce. So I'd like to give a massive thank you to Tom for sharing his expertise and insights with us today. Before we round up, any final words, Tom?
No, just thanks for having me, and looking forward to hearing about everyone on their journey to building their first integrations with Flow. So thanks again.
Great. Well, thank you again to everyone for attending, and we hope to see you again for our next webinar soon. Take care, everybody.